This is Raw, a podcast by Greta Puls. Series 2 is The Nature Cure.
Emeritus Professor Stephen Myers says the nature cure is about getting back to nature, to the fundamentals of what it means to be human. Stephen is not only one of Australia's most eminent researchers in complementary health, he is both a doctor of naturopathy and was also a registered general practitioner. I spoke to Stephen in 2018, a veritable lifetime ago now, before the era of COVID-19 and ChatGPT. I asked him about the history of the nature cure and what he saw as the difference between naturopathy and medicine. And he explained to me the concept of vitalism, which is a central tenet of naturopathy, and how it refers to the energetic realm that animates life. We are more than the sum of our parts. Take a listen.
Hi, my name's Stephen Myers. I am a professor of naturopathic medicine at Southern Cross University.
And how did you come into the field of naturopathy?
I became a naturopath, interestingly enough, by becoming an environmentalist first up. Interestingly enough, I say that if you scratch a naturopath, you'll find an environmentalist. Naturopathy's founded on the idea of the healing power of nature. So by definition, I think all naturopaths have a love for nature. So I was an environmentalist. I helped start up an organisation called Friends of the Earth in Australia, which was part of an international organisation in the 1970s. And I, with a number of colleagues, Peter Hayes and Frank Muller, lobbied the Whitlam government at the time to apply the New Environment Impact of Proposals Act to Ranger Uranium, the first major uranium mine in Australia, which they did. Friends of the Earth became a principal party to that inquiry, which gave us the capacity to actually cross-examine witnesses that gave evidence to the inquiry. Myself and colleagues followed it around Australia, and at one stage I split off to go to Darwin to actually prepare for the inquiry coming to the Northern Territory. While I was there, I woke up one morning and I couldn't walk. I had no idea what was the problem because at that particular point in time I had completely no knowledge about the body. So I went along to see a friend who was a medical doctor. He was actually on the Environment Board in the Northern Territory that I was a member of. He told me that I had a Plantar Wart, which was an ingrown wart in the sole of the foot, which I have to say was very painful. And he said, we can get rid of it, but there are 3 methods and all of them are equally painful. He said we could cut it out, he could burn it out, or he could give me an acid that could actually burn it out. Ted was a friend. I was a coward. So I said to him, look, I'll go away and I'll think about it. A friend of mine had convinced me to actually take a set of Schulzler's biochemic tissue salts with me to Darwin, which I dutifully did. I bought a book about it, but they were sort of languishing in the bottom drawer, gathering dust, until I came home that day from seeing my friend. And I opened up the book and I looked up Plantar Wart, and there was an entry and it told me to actually take this preparation, which was a low potency homeopathic. So it actually had real molecules in it. It wasn't beyond Avogadro's number. And I took this low potency homeopathic every day for 7 days. And at the end of the 7th day, I felt a tingling in the bottom of my foot, and I turned it upside down and I pressed on either side of it, and the wart popped painlessly out of my foot. Given the fact that I was told that it was going to be very painful to remove it, I thought that was fantastic. So I went off the following day to see my friend Ted, and he and I had a really engaged conversation about everything from Indigenous medicine to herbal medicine to the concept of natural therapies or alternative medicine, as it certainly was known at that particular point in time. So I decided I needed to actually research as much as I could about natural medicine. I went out and bought myself a book on herbal medicine and started just, in a sense, dabbling with myself. I was talking to a social worker who had migraine headaches, so I gave her a prescription of valerian tea, which, if you've ever tasted, is disgusting, and magnesium as a tissue salt. Anyway, lo and behold, her migraine headaches that she'd had for a very large part of her adult life went away. She started actually telling people, you need to go and see my naturopath. Or she said my herbalist initially. You need to go and see my herbalist. I got to the point in Darwin where I was seeing maybe 30 people, literally as a barefoot therapist in what I call footpath consultations. People would be walking along Smith Street or Nucky Street in Darwin and bump into me and say, oh, my cousin told me that if I saw you, I needed to ask you about this tropical ulcer that I've got on my elbow or whatever. So I started to actually just prescribe things based on my reading. And one of the things that was quite astonishing to me was how effective these medicines seemed to work. I left Darwin and went south, went from a Darwin summer to a Melbourne winter, and I studied naturopathic medicine at the Southern School of Natural Therapies in the late 70s and early 80s. So that's how I became a naturopath.
And at that time, naturopathy was starting to become very popular, I understand?
It was certainly at the start of a boom phase. There was no doubt that the Australian community were leaning towards the concept of natural medicines. One of the things that actually happened during the time I was a student is that Judy Jacker, who was the principal of the college, was involved in a very big drive to actually lobby the federal government, because it had been proposed that vitamins should actually be only available on prescription from a doctor. So I saw myself on a street corner with little white bags of powder going to people, "Psst, you want some vitamin C?" Because the idea that safe therapies would be taken away from the population was the sort of thin edge of the wedge. Communities have always had access to therapeutics. Most people have cupboards full of medicinal herbs, even if they think of them as culinary herbs, that have always been part of our tradition. We got the biggest mailbag drop that ever came to Parliament House, and the concept of making vitamins on prescriptions was shelved. So yes, there was definitely a groundswell happening in the community. It was during the big period of the development of the environment movement, which built on the anti-war movement, the development of the women's movement. There was a significant cultural shift happening. I still think that when I graduated as a naturopath, I graduated into what I call the carrot-eating, mung bean sprout chewing, long-haired hippie generation of naturopaths. I think now that naturopathic graduates are far more engaged in our culture than they were when I did it. And certainly, when the earlier pioneers were there, they were really actually sort of out on the fringes. But I think we're now actually much more mainstream.
You had a science background, I understand?
Yeah, I had a keen interest in science. Funnily enough, my dad, who I very much admired, was a physicist. He ended up a teacher and a science master and a headmaster. I didn't want to get into the family business, and I wasn't attracted to physics, but I became very interested in chemistry, and I ended up in academics. So I did end up somewhat in the family business. I've heard of the concept of having a calling, that all of a sudden people know what the next thing is in their life. I think the yogic concept is dharma, this sort of driving force in your life. I was in my first year of naturopathy, and I was in a Friday afternoon unit in transpersonal psychology. And I heard somebody say, when I finish naturopathy, I'm going to study medicine. And some wheels turned inside my mind, and I went, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Well, interestingly enough, that person didn't actually come back for second year, but I actually finished naturopathy. Getting into medicine is not an easy thing to do. So followed the process through until the door opened and I was actually able to study medicine. The reason for it, if I had to give you a rational understanding, was that I felt like I wanted to have both sides of the picture. And that, to me, was truly holistic if I actually understood the full range of what was available rather than just the alternative side. There are very few individuals practicing naturopaths who don't actually understand this concept of the fact that it's horses for courses. I once said to a class of students, if I was to fall over with acute appendicitis, what would you do? What I want people to do is to actually call an ambulance and take me to hospital, because that's the best place for me under those sorts of circumstances. Modern naturopathy is not about againstness in modern medicine. It's about being complementary to and integrated with modern medicine. There's no doubt that modern medical techniques for dealing with acute illness, with trauma, are things that naturopaths would always refer. But where naturopathy excels is dealing with chronic illness, which is an area which modern medicine has yet really to come to terms with. There was a lot of emphasis on prevention. I was very fortunate to go to the University of Newcastle's medical school. One of the things that a lot of people probably are unaware of is that people graduating from medicine at the University of Newcastle graduate in the colours of public health. They don't graduate in the classic red sash of medicine, basically because the founder, David Madison, actually believed that all doctors need to be advocates for public health. There was a theme running through part of my medical course that one-on-one medicine had actually failed to deal with chronic disease. So, medicine actually had I think, a very, clear, rational understanding about it. One of the things I think is interesting is that they didn't have a particularly sophisticated philosophy. Medicine starts off a priori that the disease is the enemy, and it's really the role of medicine to actually treat disease. And often from that comes the corollary that the absence of disease is health. The World Health Organization came to terms with that in defining health, and the first component of it is health is not just the absence of disease. In my words, it's sort of about the optimization of human potential.
Why do you think that there's so much interest in natural therapies and holistic wellness at the moment? Is it a rediscovery of knowledge we may have been disconnected from?
Well, I think it's actually about the fact that choosing these sort of softer options, because that's really part of what the allure of naturopathy is, that given two options, you cut your finger and I can do two things. I can actually give you an antibiotic or I can amputate. What would you choose? Well, everybody who I think was rational would choose to have an antibiotic. But if I had a wider spectrum, if I could say I could give you a Band-Aid and I could give you both healing and antiseptic herbal cream or non-herbal cream, would you take that over an antibiotic? And most people would say, yes, that sounds very rational. Part of the concept in naturopathy is what's called the therapeutic order, which is using the least force or the most softest option first. Doesn't mean you can't use harder options later, and it doesn't mean that harder options can't be used immediately if they're actually called for. In the case of me falling on the floor with acute appendicitis, I'm quite happy that I have a hard option at that particular point in time. But with chronic disease, it's often about the correction of underlying problems associated with lifestyle that actually lead to people to have chronic disease. And I think medicine completely underestimates and misses the approach that's taken in naturopathic medicine, which is to actually deal with all of those foundations of health, otherwise known as the determinants of health in getting people well. So we won't just focus on the disease. Actually, one of my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Joe Pizzorno, who started up the Bastyr College of Naturopathic Medicine, which is now the Bastyr University, I remember attending a lecture that Joe gave back in the 1980s, and he started out by saying naturopaths do not cure disease. And that's actually, I think, or do not treat disease, I think is probably the way he phrased it. And I think that that's actually really very appropriate. One of the things that I found very disquieting about medicine is that people would be often seen as their disease, that there's a liver cancer in bed 5C. Well, there's not a liver cancer in bed 5C. There might be Mrs. Smith who happens to have liver cancer in bed 5C. But let's actually get back down to the fundamentals, that we're dealing with individuals, and every individual has a whole manifestation of their health and well-being that we need to actually get to the root cause of. Because I was a naturopath and I practiced naturopathy for 8 years before I graduated with a medical degree, I was actually asked at one stage to actually talk to medical educators at a conference that was actually held at the University of Newcastle. I was brazen enough to say that, medicine was the only science that actually seemed to be in opposition to the foundational laws of physics. I went on to explain that one of the primary principles of physics is that organized systems actually become disorganized through a process called entropy, and that entropy increases across the arrow of time. Medicine seems to have a naive view that disease nearly arrives de novo, that if we do a test today and the test is normal, that you don't have disease. And if we do the test tomorrow and the test is abnormal, that somehow the disease has arrived de novo, that it's just suddenly appeared. Now, I'm being slightly facetious because I don't think my medical colleagues actually really believe that, but it operates somewhat on that premise. From a naturopathic perspective, we believe that the body is an inherently highly organized system and that it actually has inherent healing processes within it. That disease is an aberration in that highly organized system that actually happens over a long period of time generally. And that it doesn't actually happen de novo because we've found a test that actually demonstrates it today. From my perspective, those tests are often, very blunt in terms of what they might actually communicate. There are more subtle ways, and a lot of traditional systems of medicine, including naturopathy, have developed more capacity to look at the symptomology that somebody has and to say, in terms of normal function, that seems to be out of kilter. And then to explore that with somebody, to actually really explore their diet, to really explore their lifestyle choices. Do they choose to exercise? How do they deal with stress in their life? What are they doing in regard to anxiety and depressive symptoms and anger? Are they engaged with their family and their community? What sort of environment do they live in? What sort of environmental exposures they have? This much wider story. One of the things that I was incredibly impressed by when I was in clinical practice was that I'd finished this engagement, my first consultation, that at least went on for an hour and sometimes an hour and a half. And people would say to me with just repetition, nobody has ever taken my history like that. That's the foundation of naturopathic medicine, is to actually really truly engage and understand people, and then to be able to provide the levers that actually help them to break the bad habits and develop the good habits that'll actually bring them back into a greater state of wellness.
How many people in Australia are using naturopaths?
Well, the current best estimate from research suggests that 10% of the population, so 1 in 10 people, see a naturopath at least once a year, and I think that that's actually increasing. There's no doubt that the popularity of complementary medicine in general is actually increasing in the Australian community. So it's estimated now by some individuals to say that it's as high as 70 to 75% of people actually engage with natural medicines. The reality is probably around 60%, but there's no doubt that that's actually remaining relatively steady, and we've got some indication to say that it's actually rising.
People tend to look to naturopaths and healers if they have a more serious illness that medicine can't help them with.
One of the things that's actually interesting is that modern practitioners are actually dealing with much more complex patients than I probably did when I first went into clinical practice 30 odd years ago, where I'd be dealing with relatively simple issues, but now people can present with very chronic conditions. And I think that that's been a significant change, is that there's a greater understanding of the fact that there are alternatives available for people, and they seek natural therapists, whether it be a naturopath or somebody who practiced Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, to look at a different systems approach to ways of improving their health.
Given the popularity of naturopathy and the statistics showing how many people are using the services, do you think that naturopaths are fairly represented in the media?
No. I think there's a relatively simple answer to that. One of my friends and colleagues, Monique Lewis, did her PhD looking at media representation of herbal medicine. And she found that there was a rhetoric of danger. The same is true for most of the complementary medicines. Journalists like to have stories that have got lots of pull and hype, and they seem to appear to thrive on the concept that these things are dangerous and therefore the public need to be warned. There's lots and lots of stories about the danger, and some of them are completely ludicrous. There was a big series of headlines at some stage of the fact that herbal medicine will make men sterile. And it came from a study that I can't believe got published, where somebody actually put sperm into herbal tea and found that it actually stopped swimming. To be able to extrapolate that to consuming a herbal tea through the gut and into the blood supply and into the gonads to the sperm that are actually in the gonads, as though these herbs will actually stop the sperm from motility, was a lunacy. It was an idiocy. But that got big press at the time because people are looking for this aspect of making something sensational. Similarly, people like to actually say there's nothing in it. One of the best examples from my perspective of that actually occurred in Australia. In 2005, we had a manufacturer that was closed down by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Pan Pharmaceuticals, that meant we had the greatest recall of medicines, the majority of which were complementary medicines in Australia's history. And so people stopped taking all of these things that they were actually taking. And interestingly enough, within 6 months, they were all taking the same things. They had an opportunity to see what life was like without these medicines, and the vast majority of them decided that life was much better taking these substances, because quite often we find that they have significant impact. Yeah. One of the detractors from the general field of complementary medicine is primarily a group of doctors called the Friends of Science in Medicine. Purportedly, they believe in strong science in medicine, yet a lot of the materials that they've actually put out don't seem to be rationally based or evidence-based. They've actually written to vice-chancellors throughout Australia repeatedly trying to actually get programs in complementary medicine closed down. At the same time, they say that they actually believe in research to actually occur in complementary medicine, yet single-handedly, they've actually diminished the number of researchers in universities who are researching complementary medicines more than any other driver that I know about. They're actually got a mixed message. They're saying on one stage, we want more research, and on another stage, let's get rid of these courses. Therefore, we get rid of the academics who teach these courses, and often are the people that research these courses. I wrote an editorial for the Medical Journal of Australia pointing out the concept that academic complementary medicine in universities is exceedingly legitimate. It's actually the role of universities to play that wider role in a community to actually ensure that people that are practicing a popular profession in the community have the best education they possibly can have. It's, communities that burn books and close down university courses that actually are authoritarian and they actually suppress knowledge. And that's not the sort of society that I want to live in. It confounds me why these people spend so much of their time opposing something that doesn't seem to have a significant downside to it. We know that the iatrogenic cause of death in Australian hospitals is about 40,000 people a year. Why they're not focusing on making their own profession more effective and more rigorous and safer is completely perplexing to me. We would be lucky if we found one death associated with complementary medicine a year in Australia. And yet, we've got this group of people that are dedicated to actually oppose us. I find it bizarre. If you add up all the naturopaths and all the chiropractors and all the acupuncturists and all the osteopaths and all the Chinese herbalists and all the Ayurvedic practitioners and all the massage therapists that practice out there in the community, they're actually doing a substantive amount of good for the Australian population. I've mused with people over dinner What would happen if all of those people downed tools and actually stopped practicing? Whether the health system would actually collapse. Yet this is actually an unacknowledged component of Australian healthcare. All of the millions of consultations that actually occur that people pay for out of their pockets, they pay for the medicines out of their pockets. Ridiculously, those medicines are not GST excluded like pharmaceuticals are. People pay GST on top of the medicines that they actually take for their well-being. And a lot of them are kept out of the hospital system because of these sorts of therapies. It's one of those things that we need to actually acknowledge. We can't have a hidden health workforce in the community underpinning the current system without some degree of acknowledgement, potentially of the benefit it might be doing. I just finished a global scoping review of naturopathic medicine, and there's no doubt there is evidence from prospective trials that naturopathic medicine is good for a range of chronic diseases, including a range of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, anxiety, depression, polycystic ovarian syndrome. There's a range of things that have been demonstrated to be beneficial in pragmatic clinical trials looking at whole system, multimodality naturopathic medicine. And there are also countless papers. I did a review for the Victorian government as part of a review of naturopathy back in 2005, and we looked at the evidence for tools of trade. There is evidence for the naturopathic tools of trade for every major body system, scientific valid evidence that these therapies that are given are effective. We've got people out there in the community using tools that we know are scientifically valid, providing therapy that we have seen tested in pragmatic trials to be scientifically valid, in other words, evidence-based. I think there's a long way to go before everything a naturopath does is evidence-based, but there's enough evidence out there to say that it's highly likely that these people are doing more good than harm, that they be appropriately acknowledged for what they're actually contributing.
Well, you have a unique perspective to bring on this that perhaps people and friends of science and in medicine don't, and perhaps people who have just studied naturopathy don't, because you've studied in both camps. And how would you describe the training that you received in both areas and disciplines?
I was actually exceedingly fortunate that the training that I got in naturopathic medicine, a 4-year full-time program, was exceedingly thorough. And there's no doubt that modern naturopaths actually have training that allows them to be prime contact clinicians. I had colleagues from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Newcastle actually review our clinical examinations that we did here at Southern Cross University when we had the Bachelor of Naturopathy program. They actually considered that certainly the exams that we were actually giving were equivalent to, at the time, they were doing third and fourth year medical program exams. So there's no doubt that the education that naturopaths get are thorough. There's also no doubt in my mind, having studied medicine, that medical doctor is expected to know the pathology and the pathophysiology of disease at a much greater depth than is probably taught in a naturopathic program. There's no doubt that there is a different emphasis in the nature of treatment and in the need to have particular knowledge to be able to deal with acute emergency. The trainings are actually very thorough for what they do, but they're very different in their outcomes. One of the things that a graduate of medicine once said to me is that the most brilliant thing about a medical education is exposure to the hospital, that you get to see one, if not two or three, of everything. That clinical environment is one of the things that actually hones medical doctors that a lot of the other allied health professionals don't actually get exposed to as much as medical practitioners get exposed to. And I'm exceedingly grateful for my medical education, for that exposure, that much greater depth of knowledge that I've got. But one of the things that's actually really interesting is that apart from a great respect for public health, medicine didn't really give me a philosophical approach to being a healer. A lot of people ask me, when I studied medicine, did I find it in conflict with naturopathy? And I never did, because I found the philosophy that medicine was based on, to me, seemed very naive. that it didn't actually have a sophisticated approach to the concept of individualizing treatment, that every individual was different, that it was extremely important to get to the root cause of a problem. And it didn't have a focus on health, which just seemed to me to be bizarre. In my facetious moments, I point out to my medical colleagues that, and this is something that I think is undisputable, that we actually know that at least in chronic disease, that 80 to 85% of chronic disease has lifestyle causative factors, primarily nutrition. And yet, my facetious moment is that I say that medical education, therefore, should be 80 to 85% nutritional content. And most medical courses are lucky if they have 3 hours of nutritional lectures. So there's a mismatch between the concept of health and well-being and medicine. Really, it is, in a sense, medicine is focused on disease. And it does that exceedingly well, especially acute disease and acute trauma. Naturopathic medicine is focused on health. And I think it does that particularly well. And I think really we need a system that actually has the capacity to do both.
Can we talk a little bit about the history of naturopathy as a health discipline?
So naturopathy started in the beginning of last century in the United States by an immigrant by the name of Benedict Lust. He founded the first school of naturopathic medicine and really defined the concept of naturopathy. He actually considered it to be an eclectic practice of all natural therapies. He was a student in Europe of Father Kneipp. He had studied the European nature care tradition. During the 19th century in Europe, there was a fairly significant movement to spa therapy where people would go to sanatoriums for exposure to air and sunlight and rest and relaxation and fasting and hydrotherapy, all part of the nature cure tradition. And nature cure is really about getting back to nature, getting back to the fundamentals of what it is to be a human and what wellness is actually composed of. Lust, in developing naturopathic medicine, saw that there was a great opportunity to take all of those therapies but combine them with the developing nutritional science that was actually occurring, develop them with herbal medicines, with electric therapy, with magnetic therapy, with physical therapies that were starting to develop. Interestingly enough, it was in a period that D.D. Palmer developed chiropractic and Still developed osteopathy. There was a lot of these particular schools that started to actually crop up around a similar sort of time. And it was certainly Lust's conception that naturopathic medicine should be an umbrella practice of these sorts of therapies. Well, interesting, in the United States, naturopathic medicine significantly boomed through that period. I mean, Lust actually crossed the country back and forth. He was a prolific supporter of naturopathic medicine. He produced 2 magazines that he actually maintained, some of them weekly, for 40 years. Which is just an amazing output. We think today that if somebody actually does a blog post on a regular basis that they're a hero. Well, there were people who were doing those sorts of things back in the turn of last century in whatever way that they actually could get the information out there. So Lust not only founded it, he promoted it, and he was the one that actually led to a great degree of public engagement, and there was widespread acceptance of naturopathic medicine, and it was actually licensed at that stage in more states than it currently is in the United States. And then it went into a period of decline. It had gone from maybe 3,000 naturopathic physicians at some point down to about 300. This was in the 1950s, and a number of important luminaries in the North American naturopathic tradition got together and founded the National College of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, in Oregon. That actually remained as the sort of sole surviving college for quite a number of years until Joe Pizzorno started up the John Bastyr College of Naturopathic Medicine in Seattle in Washington state. Now there are programs in Arizona, in Bridgeport, in Connecticut, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in North America, and Bastyr has an outreach college in California. There are programs that are all through the United States. It's back now in a heyday. I think one of the big milestones for the North American profession was getting the licensure in California and the right to actually practice. One of the big differences between North American naturopathy and Australian naturopathy is this concept of licensure. So in North America, you can't practice medicine without a license. I'm sure you've seen that on lots of TV programs, or that people get charged for practicing things without a license, which means that they actually protect the practice. In Australia, we protect title. So the title of a doctor, a medical doctor, is actually a protected title, but we don't actually protect practice as such. Interestingly enough, we practice under British common law. Back in the time of Henry VIII, we had the development of the Herbalist Charter. Really interesting history that I think it was in 1512. They actually banned people practicing except those that had either appropriate qualifications in medicine, it was called physic back in those days, or they were a barber surgeon. So herbalists weren't allowed to practice in 1932. No, in 1532, the Herbalist Charter was actually passed that basically gave anybody who had a knowledge of herbs or healing waters in the king's domain to practice. The start of the Herbalist Charter is actually quite dramatic. It talks about surgeons taking large sums of money and having little cunning, which is, I think, the fact that it only took 20 years for there to be a populace uprising that the use of herbal medicine was something that should be allowed to practice. We still practice under that British common law that people who know about these things should have the right to actually practice them in the community. So we didn't have to fight in Australia for the right to practice. They had to fight for the right to practice in North America. And they fought that fight all the way up to getting the same qualification as a physician. So they've got an equal qualification to a medical practitioner in the jurisdictions that there is licensure in the US, which I think is 13 currently. In Australia, we actually were always prime contact clinicians, but we actually always saw our role was to work alongside medical practice rather than to be an alternative to medical practice. And in terms of the qualifications, there was a lot of difference. I did a review back in the mid-1980s, and Australian naturopaths were better qualified in the modalities of practice, and American naturopaths were better qualified in the medical sciences. Today, it's very similar. When we were in our heyday here at Southern Cross University, we had an exchange program with Bastyr University, and our fourth year naturopathic students would actually go to the Bastyr University clinic, and Bastyr students would come out here to Australia. The Bastyr students and the Southern Cross students were on equal par in terms of the knowledge that they had. So Australian graduates, certainly of our program here, were the equivalent of the physician level trained naturopaths working in North America.
People have an interest in natural remedies. There are influencers on social media and businesses selling products. They're picking up on some of the concepts and traditions of the nature cure. But is there a danger there as well?
That's a question that I'm going to have to actually unpack. Firstly, one of the things that's actually happening in Australia and in many countries in the world is the fact that post-World War II, we had a generation that are known as the baby boomers. And the baby boomers are now heading towards, or many of them have arrived at the edge of old age. One of the things that I love about the baby boomers, being one myself, is that somebody said the baby boomers are going to completely rewrite aging, which I think is delightful. One of the things that I think the baby boomers are doing is saying, what can I do to stay healthy? Naturopathy is actually a clinical practice of health. And so that's one of the reasons why naturopathy and the various things that are components of that, nutritional therapies, herbal therapy, soft tissue therapy, lifestyle interventions are all becoming much more widely recognised. The other component of that is the fact that the science of all of this is actually booming. I did a review a number of years ago for a journal that I was actually the editor of, where we just looked at the incredible exponential growth in the number of papers on aspects of complementary medicine. I once had a professor at the University of Newcastle dismiss the concept that vitamins could actually have any benefit beyond their physiological activity. And already the literature on some of those agents was significantly weighty. Now, especially in regard to things like herbal medicines, we've got substantively more better understanding of them. There's much greater degree of publications about them. One of the things about the internet is the fact that knowledge is now widely available. Medicine used to be a secret fraternity that had a specialized language that only doctors could talk. Now, all of that knowledge is actually available to people who have a computer and can actually use a search engine. We're, in a sense, entering a completely new knowledge age where, while there may be knowledge experts, we're not now dealing with hidden bodies of knowledge that only experts have access to. Quite often, modern clinicians are faced with patients that actually have more knowledge of their condition than the health provider, does. Now, the health provider quite often will have more nuanced understanding of their condition and much more detailed understanding of its pathophysiology and its implications for health and wellness. But we have some exceedingly well-read people who want to know what's happening in their bodies. All of those things to contribute to a greater degree of interest in, trial of, general utilisation and adoption of the whole sort of gamut of natural medicines. There's certainly concerns that it's hard sometimes for people to find the best credible information on the internet. One of the concepts that has actually occurred is that everybody is now potentially a journalist. Everybody now has the capacity to actually communicate and express their views. There is a great universalism actually happening that's actually leveling lots of playing fields about the internet. But one of the things that can actually happen is that individuals can put out information that's actually highly biased, potentially inaccurate, sometimes incorrect, and some of it, I'm sure, is probably downright dangerous. The concept of being a consumer and the idea of caveat emptor, buyer beware, we probably need to actually Latinize reader beware. Everything you read needs to actually be considered in the light of every other thing you read. One of the, I think, exceedingly critical and important concepts in the evidence-based medicine movement is this concept of the totality of evidence. One of the things that the totality of the evidence talks to is the idea that you can't take one piece of information in isolation and believe it's true until you've taken a look at all the other pieces of information pertaining to the same thing. And when you look at all of the information that's pertaining to that thing, you then have the totality of the evidence. So I can point out to you a paper that says X herb or X drug is effective, but there might be 6 other papers that say X herb or X drug is not effective. You have to look at the totality of the evidence to know that in that situation where there was one paper saying it worked and 7 papers saying, or 6 papers saying it didn't, the totality of the evidence probably is saying it doesn't work. The same is true for somebody who actually goes onto the internet. Don't get caught up with one person and one website. Spread your wings or your surfing board a lot further and seek lots of opinions. Look for people that actually tell you about the benefit and also the detriment. Interestingly, I was once on live-to-air radio and somebody actually asked me on the spot, how do I know that I'm going to see a good naturopath? Stopped for a moment and I thought about it, and I actually realised that the answer is the same for a naturopath or a surgeon. One of the questions that you should ask for somebody you meet for the first time who you want to engage in therapy with is, what is the limitations of your practice? Every health professional should know where their limits lie and should be able to articulate them clearly. If somebody says, I don't have limits, I think I said in the radio show, get up from your chair and run out the door. Because people need to know what the limits of their practice are. People know the limits of their practice. They generally know what safe practice is, and you're more likely to be able to trust them. Same thing's true with internet knowledge. If somebody tells you that this thing is a wonder cure, it works in every case, that it actually cures everything from ingrown toenails to hair falling out, then you probably need to actually approach it with a bit of skepticism, because we know nothing that cures ingrown toenails and hair falling out simultaneously, and there's certainly no wonder cures that we're actually aware of. And that's the thing that can actually happen with people's evangelism of some aspects of natural medicine, is that they get overly carried away with the benefit without actually understanding the downside or the appropriateness of the knowledge they're trying to actually convey.
One of the things that people probably are very confused at the moment is being online and seeing all sorts of different information about what they need to take, what magnesium does, what this does, and what diets to be on. And I just wanted to get your overall view on nutrition and its importance to health. So if you could talk to a little bit about how important nutrition is to health and well-being.
Well, certainly the early naturopaths, and one of those was Henry Lindlahr, who wrote a seminal text called Nature Cure, believed that diet was probably the foundation of well-being. That concept of that you are what you eat, I think, is actually very true. I completely agree with Michael Palin, who wrote, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." That's great advice. I think the approach to diet should be fundamentally one of common sense. Science actually says a number of things that we need to take into account. Firstly, it basically says eat fruits and vegetables. The more, especially vegetables, you get in your diet, the healthier that you're likely to be. So it's saying eat an abundance of plants. And the second piece of advice is eat as widely as possible. They've done work that has actually demonstrated, primarily in the elderly, but I think it follows through in terms of nutritional quality, is the greater the variety of foods you eat, the more likely you are to get all the things that you actually need. If you wake up in the morning and you have Cocoa Pops and milk for breakfast, you have a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch, and you actually have McDonald's for dinner, and you do that every day, that's not a healthy diet. You need to actually have variety. The wider the variety, the better. That's the second component of that. Then I think you need to actually look at issues that there is some nutritional evidence to suggest that you're probably not served by having a diet that's fundamentally meat-based. You're better to actually eat meat in moderation. If you're not inclined to be a vegetarian or a vegan, you should actually include things like fish in your diet rather than an abundance of red meats. So with those sorts of things, that starts to look like, the Mediterranean type diet. And there's some good evidence to suggest that there's some benefit in that sort of diet. While there have been changing elements in our understanding of fats, nobody has really still demonstrated that eating a large amount of saturated fat is actually good for you. And, there's lots of people out there who not only consume large amounts of saturated fat from animal sources, but I think that there's a lot of hype about coconut oil, and that people are actually consuming that as though it's actually some sort of wonder food, and nobody's actually ever been able to demonstrate that it is. I have no difficulty with anybody taking anything in moderation, but no food should actually be considered to be something that actually is going to actually confer benefits if there's not some understanding underneath it.
With the 1930s alkaline diet I researched, there was a list of foods to eat for alkalinity and another list of foods that cause acidity.
With the alkaline diet, you need to actually look at the science behind it. And there is an understanding of the fact that different foods actually lead to different levels of acid excretion from the body. One of the things that if you look up the sort of classic alkaline diet, you'll find that there are a list of things that actually cause alkalinity and a list of things that cause acidity. Now, to a degree, they've got some of those things right, but science has actually demonstrated a much more accurate listing of those things. So, for instance, most popular sites talking about the alkaline diet will tell you that sugar causes acidity. Well, the reality is that sugar is completely neutral. And even a lot of naturopaths fall off the chair when they actually hear me say that. But when you think about it, given the fact that sugar is a fructose molecule and a glucose molecule, this is sort of classic table sugar. Glucose is our fundamental fuel. The idea that glucose affected our internal chemistry in such a way would actually be a very poor design. So sugar actually is neutral. There are reasons why we don't want to eat sugar from a physiological perspective that's got nothing to do with alkalinity or acidity. Interestingly enough, the alkaline diet is the sort of diet that I recommended a moment ago in terms of eating lots of fruits and vegetables. The alkaline diet and the concept of eating a Mediterranean-style diet that was low in red meat and higher in things like fish was something that, the early naturopaths actually talked about 100 years ago, and we now are starting to see that there's good evidence pointing in those sorts of directions. There's no doubt that there are some foods that have a much greater effect in regard to acidity on the body than other foods. So, for instance, a group of German researchers actually gave people, I think it was a 100-gram bolus of a particular food, and that was all they had, and they looked at acid output at a set time after they'd actually consumed it. And they, for instance, discovered that Parmesan cheese and the foods that they probably tested about 50 foods, had the highest amount of acid excretion, and that green leafy vegetables had the lowest amount of acid excretion, which is the sort of thing that these classic diets would actually say. Given the fact that our body is primarily a mildly alkaline organism, it seems to me to be somewhat common sense that we actually eat a diet that is mildly alkaline. The way that I would translate that is that, don't make Parmesan cheese the focus on your plate. Make a pile of spinach, and if you want to put a little grating of Parmesan cheese on top of it, that sounds delightful. Or have it without Parmesan cheese, but eat a mildly alkaline diet is probably appropriate. In terms of the role of alkalinity and acidity in the development of chronic disease, one of the things that I'm very clear about, if you look at the physiology of what actually happens in the body, the concept of pH, no doubt, actually is incredibly tightly regulated. And so the people that say you can't alter the pH of the blood is because we have all sorts of internal mechanisms, the two major ones being the kidneys and the lungs, that play a role in ensuring that we actually maintain a pH at a certain sort of level. At the same time, I think that if we eat a diet that's got too many acid foods, we probably have more organic acids floating around our body that need to be balanced by the production of bicarbonate. They actually potentially have ongoing sorts of effects. There's some building evidence that in individuals that have particular organic acid profiles, they have a particular tendency to particular health conditions. Now, I know I've been incredibly general there because I don't have that evidence to the forefront, and I'm not going to actually quote something that I haven't got in front of me. My curiosity has been piqued by this phenomena that makes me think, okay, there may be something that we haven't actually considered in regard to the concept of this alkaline diet. One of the things that I would say is that, from my perspective, it's always important to be a scientist, to look for where the truth is, but to always remain open-minded.
A founding principle of naturopathy is the concept of vitalism, the idea of a universal energy or a life force that is greater than us. This is a much criticised concept. What are your views on vitalism?
Vitalism comes from the concept that life is a special entity, and it's animated. This concept that Shelley had about, the concept of animating dead flesh was the idea of imbuing life. Interestingly enough, we as human beings have never been able to actually bring life into being at this particular point in time. All of the traditional medicines talk about the fact that life energy is something that actually permeates through living systems. So we talk about it as the vitality in naturopathic medicine. In Chinese medicine, they talk about it as qi. In Japanese medicine, they talk about it as ki. In Ayurvedic medicine, they talk about it as prana. And all of these systems have this fundamental respect for the concept of living energy. I need to say that vitalism is one of those terms that actually is often confused, that it actually is attributed to often religious overtones. I came across a paper by Greco called The Vitality of Vitalism, about why vitalism as a concept has not died, even though it's actually been attacked and attacked and attacked. One of the things that Greco points out, which I thought was actually quite delightful, is that vitalism has a polyvalent definition. It has a definition that has a greater interaction with a religious connotation. So the concept of vitalism being a connection with spirit. While I don't have any difficulty with that as a belief, vitalism in naturopathic medicine comes from the other component that Greco pointed out, which was a naturalistic vitalism that comes from the concept of life in the natural world. So that's the vitalism of naturopathic medicine, that we believe that life is a special entity. As such, we believe that life obviously needs to actually be valued and respected. There's something about life that is an entity that we need to take in its totality. The concept that comes from systems thinking is that you can take all the parts of a system, but it's not until the system actually functions do you get what they call emergent phenomena. Life is an emergent phenomena. We aren't just a pile of magnesium and potassium and phosphorus and chlorine, and we're more than the sum of our parts. That's the vitalistic philosophy. It comes from this concept of the respect of life, believing that living systems have dynamic living energy. In acupuncture, that would be the meridians, which have actually been measured. You can actually put a galvanometer over skin and actually trace these acupuncture meridians, that they're potentially Ayurvedic medicine centers of energy in the body. I don't know that there's actually any proof for that yet, but as a scientist, I remain open-minded to that concept. It's about this concept that we have to actually approach people who are living systems as a totality. We can't actually just deal with a liver or a toenail. We actually have to deal with a living person. And that living person needs to be seen as the emergent phenomena of all of the things that make them up.
That was Stephen Myers speaking with me in 2018. Thanks for listening.
Raw is a podcast by Greta Puls. Subscribe to Raw, the Nature Cure, where you get your podcasts, or visit the website, all one word, rawthepodcast.com.